know me, it's something I'm actually very interested in. I think in some ways it's maybe the most important thing that I could offer as an academic. So particularly interested in pursuing this, even though in some ways it's not really my background. And I think that something's missing from this, but it's sort of interesting because here's my experience. I've been giving this talk for about 10 years, but it's been evolving, I guess, as you would expect an evolutionary psych talk to do. It's evolving. And I must say that I believe that right now that it's more relevant than ever before. And in just in context of very immediate, the pandemic and the protesting. But what you'll see is that over the past 10 years, some of the transitions that have gone on technologically, as we'll talk about, have made this more relevant. And I was trying to do a GIF of a train wreck, but I couldn't figure out how to get it on here for some reason. But that's kind of how I'm feeling now. I'm feeling like this is a slow motion train wreck, and you see it coming, and there's lots of people that are talking about this now, but it's hard to get the attention. And I'll give you some very good examples of this. It's hard to get broader attention on this issue. And once again, nothing more profound, I think, as you'll see at the end, at least in my opinion. So it is like the elephant in the room, like everyone's going on with their business here, right? But no one's noticing the elephant, where people, right? And the other thing that comes to mind is this is Nero fiddling when Rome burns. And right, and I kind of feel like that's what we're doing, that we're fiddling. We have all these like trivial concerns that we're pursuing politically and missing the big ones. And by the way, just for the record, there may be some politics in this talk. I do not believe any politicians represent us well. Certainly there's worse players in some ways than others, right? But, and I will show you, if we can get to the case study on the pandemic, everybody screwed this up. So this is not a anti any group. This is, and the reason is, what we'll talk about is their incentives. But so anyway, so we're, our population and our politicians, they're talking about stuff that's totally irrelevant in the big picture. Now, by the way, this stuff that they're talking about would be good if the big picture was solved, but right now the big picture is not solved. And most of what we're talking about is irrelevant. And without making political statements, but some people that have written about this really will say, like, some things that are quite eye-opening about like what we attend to, and meanwhile the city's burning, and it's almost like a Nero's worried about, what he's having for lunch or something like that, right? So, all right. So let's just kind of open your mind a little bit to this, a couple of background points here. I'm gonna, some evolutionary psychology, eminent evolutionary psychologists, some interesting statements. For those of you that don't have any background in this, this is more important. If you have some background in this, is less important. But so this is one of my favorites, Diana Fleischman. She studies the evolution of morality. So she'll pop up here a few times. And one prominent criticism of evolutionary psychology is that it condones immoral behavior by pointing to its natural origins. So it's like, you could say, look, something like, certain roles were selected for, or forced copulation was selected for, as an example. But the key point here is that this is not to explain it away and say, oh, this exists, so therefore it's okay, right? What she's saying is you first must acknowledge the shadow of our evolved morality in order to transcend it. You must acknowledge it. In our clinical terms, this is very much like you've got to accept the problem or acknowledge the problem before you can move forward, right? So important point to keep in mind as we move forward here. 2, Steven Pinker, another evolutionary psychology luminary. And what he's pointing out here is most activities that people admire, avoiding fattening foods, being faithful, turning the other cheek, loving my neighbor, being altruistic, are in fact unnatural, what I'll add here, unnatural from an evolutionary perspective. Meaning the opposite things, as we'll talk about, were selected for, right? To overeat, to punch your neighbor, to be selfish rather than altruistic. And so once again, we got to keep that in mind, that we're not bad or evil people. As I talk about this, I'm a human, you know, just like you are, so it shouldn't feel critical in that way. But it is important to understand our limitations. And the fact is that our limitations partly come, or largely come, from our evolutionary history. And then the third one, a person that wrote a book, The Moral Animal, and early on introduced people to evolutionary psychology, Robert Wright. And he said, he closes the book with, to be a moral animal, we must first realize how thoroughly we are not. And once again, some of this can be eye-opening because we tend not to think of ourselves in certain ways. And we'll talk about processes that allow for that. So, you know, I'm on this mission of people paying attention to human nature, right? What I mean by that is like any other nature. So, you know, Peaches has a nature, and a pit bull has a nature, and a giraffe has a nature, and a tiger has a nature, right? We can make discriminations in how they are based on their nature. And I believe that even in our field, if you think about it, right, we have no agreed upon theory of human nature. We're psychologists. Like, how could you not have we deal with humans. How could we not have an agreed upon theory of nature? And then if I present this theory of nature, like I have a bit in psychology groups, they tend to sort of push back at it. So I was just out of curiosity, I Googled human nature, and Wikipedia came up, and this is the definition. Now, this is my emphasis to red, but human nature is a bundle of characteristics, including ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, which humans are said to have naturally. The term is often regarded as capturing what it is to be human, or the essence of humanity. And then this is from Wikipedia. The term is controversial because it is disputed whether or not such an essence exists. So the idea is that this could even be controversial despite the scientific data. And I'm going to make some key points in a second just to put us on the same page. I mean, the idea that human nature is controversial, you might even argue that like what you say about human nature is controversial. But the idea that humans have a nature is controversial is just a crazy idea. And I won't get into this today, but people have heard me talk about this. And that this is because we pay attention to the blank slate hypothesis, which overemphasizes culture and the influence of the environment, despite the fact the data becoming stronger and stronger to the contrary. But we won't get into that today. We'll just take that as a given. Okay, so let me make a couple of sort of essential points here. So I'm going to just ask you to take these as givens for now, because we need this background to move forward. But that actually, I did a lecture for like Hofstra, like a public lecture. I forgot what the purpose of it was, and they put it on YouTube. So if anybody wants the details of it, here's the YouTube. It's like an hour lecture sort of covering some of these details. So just so we're on the same page, right? All species evolve through the process of natural selection, and humans are just another species, right? We're not exceptional. And people that study comparative psychology and evolutionary psychology really show this very clearly. We think we're special, but we're not. In fact, other species are just remarkably similar to humans, even having different gender-specific behaviors. Like all species, humans have a coherent and predictable nature across the species that is only minimally influenced by the environment, right? So once again, like if you take something like a tiger, like I don't want to come across a tiger in any context because I know something about its nature. Now it's possible a pet tiger is like friendlier than a tiger in the wild or vice versa, I don't know. But I know a tiger's nature. I'm not interested in coming into contact with one, right? And so that's an important point. 4, this is really critical to our discussion today. All species are designed to function in an environment in which they evolve. Most humans no longer function in that landscape. So this is something that we'll talk about called mismatch theory. And the idea is that we're living in an environment that we haven't evolved to function in. So once again, the best example I could give here, it's like, let's say if we took a tiger and put them in the middle of Manhattan, they're mismatched to that environment. right? They're not really, they'll function, but they're not going to be the same. They're not going to behave the way you would expect in a natural environment. That's true of humans, and that's an essential point for what we'll talk about today in terms of existential threats. 5, humans are the only species that largely design their own environment, especially first world industrialized countries. Something like urban living is just unnatural. Humans don't do well in that. There's all types of problems that come from that. Humans, throughout their evolutionary history, did not live with large groups of people. They live with maximum 100 people. And thus, this also creates evolutionary mismatches. And in particular, I just want you to think about let's get some of these ideas. I mean, imagine if you took an elephant and said, design the environment as you want. Like, what would it look like? I guess it would be loaded with peanuts, and I don't know like much about elephant behavior. But the idea is that that's what humans do, though. So we don't always design the environment in the best way, which is going to be the point I'm making. We're driven in some ways to design it that may be in problematic ways. And I'm going to give you a couple of obvious examples just because this is an important point. These evolutionary mismatches can have negative impact, including an end to the society as we know it, perhaps the species. I'll take on both of those as existential threats. And going back to my train wreck, we appear to be headed this way. Unfortunately, this talk is more true today than 10 years ago. And I'll present some information that will show you that. And so, by the way, if for those of you know me, like I'm an optimist despite this topic. And the reason that, so it may not seem that way, it may seem like I'm pretty dark, but not. I actually think that the future may not be inevitable, but we have to do something about it. And some of these will be large scale changes, things that we're just not used to doing for that to happen. Unfortunately, the pessimist in me says that people just can't attend to this because of failure of imagination. So until it's too late, right? And the pandemic was a perfect example of failure of imagination, right? I mean, the pandemic was whistling for months that it's coming. And all of our leaders, from Trump to Cuomo to Pelosi, treated it like it was a surprise, right? And it wasn't a surprise. In fact, everything happened as we would have expected. If you ask someone, what do you expect to happen? Well, they're like, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be bad in New York City because of population density and so on. So anyway, so these are the key points to keep in mind. I'm going to take these as given. I'd be more than happy to discuss any of these at the end if you want more information or don't agree with something, but we need to sort of accept these to move forward for this purpose. I usually give this talk at the end of a whole course in evolutionary psychology, so there's a lot of background that people have that I was trying to figure out how to give that now. Okay, so let's think about what your genes are programmed to do from an evolutionary perspective. There's 3 things. They're pretty simple, right? The gene in your body wants to make sure you survive, because if you don't survive, you're out of the game of evolution. So one thing about all our genes is whoever's carried them before have survived, at least survived long enough for step 2 to reproduce, right? So we're all the product of someone who survived long enough to reproduce. And point 3, they successfully raised you to a young adult and capable of continuing this cycle, right? The genes just sort of continue through generations. They're passed on. They just partially occupy our bodies as vehicles to pass, right? We die and they live for another day. And that's basically a simple way of looking at the evolutionary process from a genetic standpoint. The only slight twist here is that humans are a social species. So we don't only favor those who are genetically related, although we strongly favor those, like our offspring, but we also favor those we cooperate with. This is not unique to humans, that, you've heard the term like, you scratch my back and I scratch yours. I don't know if that's an old term, right? But this is literally true with monkeys even, that if a monkey has groomed another monkey, they're more likely to be helped in a dangerous situation than if they haven't groomed each other. So there literally is, well, what have you done for me? And this is true in rats and bats and many other species as well. Social species are, although once again, there's favoritism towards genetic relatedness, that there's also those who you cooperate with, right? And we'll talk more about that. You have to keep in mind that, remember, this is the biggest mistake people make with about evolution. There was even an op-ed in the Times a couple of years ago that they published missing this point. It was about the evolution of depression. And they said, how could depression be an adaptation? It only causes problems in the current environment. That may or may not be true, by the way, but let's forget about that for a second. The fact is, you can only understand the adaptational value of any trait in the environment that it evolved in, right? So if you look at a hummingbird with a long beak and stick it in Manhattan, where there's no flowers that require a long beak, you're like, well, why does this thing have a long beak? This is a disadvantage in this environment. But in the environment that it evolved in, the long beak was like a long neck for a giraffe. It allowed them to access food, and as a result, hummingbird beaks got longer and longer. So remember, you can only understand the function in the environment that it evolved in. And so I just want to get just a basic point. This is the empirical view of human nature, and what you could see, it sort of starts at sort of based on Maslow's hierarchy, but made empirical, and if you will, sort of takes us through survival, right? Survival, social connections, mating, reproduction, and taking care of that offspring, right? And you need this cycle just to continue, right, for evolution to take place. And so, you can see this in any species, right? You know that I walk my grandson a couple of days per week to a duck pond, and the ducks have babies, the geese have babies. This is over in Merrick Duck Pond there, and what we see right now is the geese chase us when we get into close contact with the baby, whatever those goslings or whatever the babies are called, right? And and they're just demonstrating this process, right? They've survived, they've mated, and they protect their young fiercely until they're adults, and that cycle continues. It's true with every species. And then we're not going to get into this, but I just want you to know this is becoming this. There are people working on this as an open forum project on literally defining the details of human nature like a periodic table. And it's quite interesting. If you want to look at this, we're going to talk about one of these today, which is called the us versus them mechanism, which is an important one for my purposes today. But I just want you to give a sense of, this is just not somebody sitting there with some like armchair theory. This is empirical work. People are looking at the function. They're looking at the universality of these traits across many populations, including hunter-gatherers, and they're even tracing it to the biological underpinnings, proximate causes, what's going on neurochemically in the system. So this will be the future of human nature. There'll be a periodic table. And like here, by the way, here's snake phobia. It's under natural selection, survival selection, right? All humans have snake phobia. Primates have snake phobia. No surprise, right? That we shared an environment where if you felt snakes were cute, you were eliminated from the gene pool. If you were frightened of snakes and ran from them and detected them easily, you lived another day. You're represented in the gene pool. No surprise. This is natural selection. All of our brains are have a fear of snakes. And even if we don't see any, like on Long Island, and let's use the primates example. Primates who are raised in a zoo are terrified of snakes. So, all right, so even if they've never seen one, it's irrelevant to their environment. So the basis of what I'm going to be talking a lot about today is mismatch theory, meaning this: no species is designed to undermine the entire existence of its species. So humans are unique. Maybe, by the way, most species try to annihilate members of their species, right? And humans do that. But most species can't annihilate their entire species because they don't have the technology to do so. They would if they could, right? If you took a chimpanzee, probably, and it was somewhat rational, and you said, listen, take this bomb and you can get rid of all the other chimpanzees, especially except your group, and say, absolutely, I'm doing that, because it would not be competing with other chimpanzees. So, right, we're just another species. We do this every day at some level. The question is, can it get out of hand now because of technology? And this is what we refer to as mismatch theory, right? And I'm just going to make a couple of points to show you how mismatch is occurring and what the personal implications are, just to, once again, give you a flavor if you've not been exposed to this idea before. That will help me later on. So let's look at something like the prevalence of obesity in the US in adults, right? So what you could say is from 1960 to projected 2030, it's gonna go up by 5 times, right? So genetics can't, this would take about 30,000 generations if this was truly genetic. So we have hundreds of thousands of years to get a change like this. But well, you know, right? You don't need me to tell you this. The environment has changed. That's why. So what did we evolve in? This is like classic mismatch theory. We evolved in a food scarce environment. So those who overate and preferred high fattening foods were more likely to survive. If you like to nibble on iceberg lettuce or something like that, you didn't survive when there was a famine. Bring us to the present, from the past to the present, right? People were hunting their food, it was scarce, right? This is the environment we evolved in. And look how easy, right? I could have food brought literally to my office, you know, with no more than typing a few keys. Maybe you burn 2 calories. Imagine how many calories you're burning here to secure food. Not to mention, and I don't want to get too much into this, but it's just such a good example to illustrate this, the foods that we eat are primarily artificial. So if you take something like a potato chip as an example, there is no food in the natural environment that's as salty as a potato chip that contains salt, right? So it's made to you know, literally made to appeal to you. And so this explains this. It's a mismatch between the environment that we were built for and the environment that we evolved in. And just for the record, that there is no obesity in the wild, right? Except the only other animals that are obese are our pets, because we overfeed them and they're also kind of lazy, right? They're not having to chase their food down. So this is not genetic, except for a small percentage of cases, which is just normal variability, not 50%. This is enormous cost, by the way, in terms of society. It's purely behavioral. Diabetes going up. I just want to show you. So, okay, we're more miserable than ever before. Let's look at a psychological factor, right? That what we see is every measure of mental health is worse, right? And by the way, this is not the pandemic. This is pre-pandemic, right? And we know it's getting worse over time. And so, you know, here's, you know, negative experience index over time. And what you could say is in 2006, right? It's going up, going up, going up. You can see, once again, I don't want to get into details of this. I just want to show you that things are getting worse, right? Antidepressant prescription drugs soaring in industrialized countries from 2016 to 2020. Okay. All disorders increasing substantially in the world. This is world data, right, as countries become industrialized. And just last point to make here, let's kind of go through this quickly, but I just want to make this point. Overall increase in suicide in the US, 24.5%. Now, think about it. Imagine how much money is spent on suicide interventions, DBT, research. You know, we understand this better. Yet, look at how bad this is, right? By the way, this is so bad that it actually, for the first time, now I believe it's 3 years in a row, has led to a decline in the average life expectancy in the US. And once you take out the suicide and the overdoses, it goes back up again. So suicide, what are called deaths of despair, are just sort of off the hook right now in terms of, right? And So, and this last point, I came across this Harvard Human Flourishing Project. They're not evolutionary psychologists, but it's interesting. On all measures, humans are flourishing less, and it's worsening over time. Less happiness, less meaningfulness, less social connection, less sex, lower marriage rates, less trusting of others. And what's interesting, it's worse than industrialized countries, that is the richest countries. So the poorer countries, the people are happier. Now, this makes sense from a mismatch perspective, because think about it, what's happening is, right, as we become more mismatched to our environment, our basic needs are not being met from an evolutionary perspective. Think about it, if you're a hunter-gatherer, every day is meaningful. They're not filling out that ACT survey on creating meaning in their life, right? We have to find meaning often, but if you're living for survival, you have meaning every day. When we look at hunter-gatherers, there's no depression in that population, zero, right? And when we look at our society, there's 25% of the population is depressed, right? So it's a paradox, because in some ways we live better than kings did 200 years ago. You know, even the average middle-class person, yes, everybody is emotionally and physically worse off than ever before. And the only reason that people are not dying sooner is because of the miracles of medical science, meaning this, you can keep, if you look at these diabetes rates here, right? So people are living now 40, 50 years with diabetes. That never would have happened in the past. But as a result of medications, biologic medications, so on, it's expensive, but you could keep people alive. Their quality of life is certainly impaired, but you can keep people alive. So only medical science is allowing people to stay alive, right? You can get cardiac, bypass surgeries and on and on and on, you know, all these things, right? Okay, so I made my point. I'm just trying to show you that mismatch is a major factor, and I do believe it's something that we're not paying much attention to in our own area of clinical psychology. And once again, thinking about what should we be doing when we're finding these kind of numbers? I mean, imagine if we weren't doing suicide interventions, what the rate of increase would be, right? Okay. So this is all disturbing, but that's not why we're here today. My main thing is to focus instead on a bigger picture here. I just wanted to show you how mismatch matters, right? How it's occurring. And basically, the premise here is that if we don't do anything, right? This is like that accident in slow motion. If we don't do anything, human nature will continue to determine the direction the future takes, not our conscious will or whatever glimpse of morality or rationality we have. And this will be, I'll try to make this case today. I think it's an easy case to make. It's a bit more glorified example than looking at tigers or chimpanzees, the way they compete, but not much different. And what we have to start with is human nature is an outgrowth of natural selection, which starts with survival of the fittest. As a result, all species, including humans, are selfish, they're violent, and they're tribalistic. These are the three guiding principles of our underlying evolutionary history. Evolution does not reward altruism, peacefulness, or impartiality, right? Oh, everybody's good. And as a result, this is in our DNA. Now, context matters. And what you could see is when context changes, things can change as well. So, perfect example is what happened when there was a rumor that said there wasn't going to be toilet paper available. Everybody hoarded toilet paper. Believe it or not, there's been articles written like, are we actually using more toilet paper or are we hoarding it, right? We're hoarding it. We're not using more toilet paper. So instead of being on the store shelves or in Amazon's warehouse, it's in our closets. And we did that with Purell, and we did that with soap and bleach products. Try to get a bleach product, right? So the reality is that when the context, normally we weren't hoarding these things, but when the context changes, they seem more important, we start hoarding them, right? This is just a sign of selfishness. You might give it to your child or your friend, but you're not gonna give it to a stranger who needs toilet paper. Okay, So selfish, violent, tribalistic people armed with modern technology that can create enormous harm creates the greatest risk to human survival. So let's just start here for a second. Imagine this. I tell you someone's selfish, violent, and tribalistic. Do you want that group to have a nuclear bomb? Probably not, right? Well, that's the case. And but I'm not talking about Trump or president, right? Meaning anybody that has it and everybody else that has it, right? All the other nuclear armed countries, they're all the same, right? And so it's not a surprise that there's countries like North Korea, as an example, that are like, look, we want to send a nuclear bomb to Hawaii. We just can't figure out how to do it. Right? Give them credit for being honest. Let's start with making the case that how selfish we are. Approximately half the world's population has never made a phone call. I just want to give you context for a second. Approximately 40% of the world's population does not have regular access to a toilet. So the reality is we're so disconnected from the lack of resources that other groups have. We know it a little bit, right? But the reality is we don't know that. Now, here's my concern, by the way. I'll sort of jump ahead to this, but the problem is that this is going to become a problem for us. This is going to become a problem in the United States. This is not going to be some country in Africa that maybe we don't really care about, right? This is going to be in the United States. I'm going to make the case why that is. And this is going to be a big problem. Right, so we could look at money world, money buys everything else. So money is the currency of resources. Like maybe for monkeys they want bananas, and whatever, birds want worms. Humans want money. Don't want to get into the detail. We just saw this play out with the pandemic. The more money you had, the less likely you were to die from the pandemic, right? The more money you had, the easier it was to socially distance fully. Right? Money provides all types of advantages. Here's some stuff on looking at life expectancy and money. Once again, not the purpose of the talk today. You know this, so I'll just sort of highlight this, right? Money is, as a resource in the United States and throughout the world, is distributed not equally, but basically 80% of the world's resources are held by 20% of the population, right? 20% of the world's resources are held by 80% of the population. So there's a huge disparity. And once again, one of the concerns is, from when I first gave this talk to today, this disparity is growing at an alarming rate because of the way technology is growing. And I'm going to get more specific about that. I just want you to keep that in mind, though. This is growing. This is not heading in the other direction. This is breakneck speed growing in the United States as well as throughout the rest of the world. The haves and the have-nots are, you're saying, further polarization, not the opposite, okay? Doesn't matter if it's the US or anywhere in the world. And by the way, just for the record, right, I'm saying that this is selfish, meaning we don't have to live this way. And look, I live the same, once again, I don't mean to be like lecturing you and I'm like this pillar of morality. I'm not. I'm living the same way that everybody else is. I'm also living being selfish with my resources when I could be doing much more. And I don't think it's about a choice issue, by the way. I think it needs to be legislated, but more about that later. Right? Let me think about it. Like, we can't even pay people minimum wage, right? You think about $15 an hour, you're working 40 hours a week, it's $600. There's lots of people working in place like McDonald's, that's a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and like to pay them $15 an hour seems like outrageous, right? Because all the money is going to the wealthy stockholders of McDonald's and CEO. And by the way, what's ironic, and I won't get into this here, I just can't help but to mention it. All of a sudden, when we needed these low-wage workers, we all virtue signaled to them. We're like, oh, thank you, the cashiers and so on. I wrote a blog on this because I couldn't take the commercials anymore. If you want to look at it, and I said, stop calling them heroes, because you know what? Tomorrow, right, what you're going to do is you're going to go back and not wanting to pay them any extra money. Once we don't need them anymore, they're disposable. And we're seeing that already, by the way. The hospitals in New York City got like a 20% cut rather than battle pay. So, right, and that's part of evolution. We signal our virtue, right? We're like, oh, look at me. Oh, thank you, you're a hero. Well, give me a battle pay. Don't call me a hero. So, okay, I can't help to say that, but all right. Wealth inequality is going to be hugely destabilizing, right? And this is the first major point to keep in mind. I know there's a lot of text on this. So basically what we see is enormous wealth inequality growing. And as I mentioned before, when we look in we have information on this, by the way. When we see this, like in countries like South America, right? What you see is the have-nots engage in pretty aggressive, criminal, violent behavior, kidnappings, and so on. And so what do the wealthy people in South American countries do? They hire private security. They don't worry. The police are corrupt in those countries. So, so in those countries, the police are corrupt. And they literally drive bulletproof Mercedes with their private security in a house with a boat. This is where the world is headed if we don't do something about it. And by the way, what's good is not opinion. I'm going to show you some examples in a second. So there's lots of economists and political science who are interested in this. This is a great book, by the way, The Meritocracy Trap. This, if you want the most dystopic view of tomorrow, is worth a read. Brief History of Tomorrow. But I thought I had read this point somewhere. I can't remember where, so I can't give them credit. I thought it was such a great point, though, because it really illustrates things. Based on the current projections, we are likely to crown the first trillionaire. Most likely this is going to be Jeff Bezos of Amazon, meaning his company's worth $1 trillion. He'll be worth $1 trillion when the US unemployment rate is expected to be about 25 to 30%. Those events are going to occur together. Now, just think about it. It makes sense why, though. Who's benefiting? Let's just take the pandemic for a second. Whose business has grown? Amazon, right? Whose business grows from technology? Amazon. By the way, I love Amazon. I shop on it all the time, but they probably wouldn't want to sponsor this talk, right? But the reality is, though, this is why we can't get rid of Amazon, right? We can't. We wouldn't want to get rid of Amazon, but we have to figure out a way to not create financial vulnerability for a large proportion of the population. And if you think like, oh, how could this be? It seems crazy, right? Well, we're kind of at that level right now, right? But how could this happen? It's pretty simple, right? Think of the way capital is created now as a result of technology. Basically, what you have is Amazon makes more money the more robots they use, right? They're not paying people. So if you've seen that video of an Amazon factory on YouTube, Google it. It's remarkable, right? Robots they don't look like the robots that we planned, but they do all the work. And so they don't pay people, right? So the money goes to Amazon, but they employ less and less people, right? And when I'll sort of talk about this more later. So it actually makes perfect sense economically why this is the case. If you're Facebook, the more users you have doesn't cost you more money. It's just profit. If you're selling software, the more people that use it, it's not costing you more. It's not like you're building cars where there's a huge labor force. You're just making more money. Technology allows lots of money, right? The reason that Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or the Twitter guy, he's going to come up later in this talk. The reason that they're billionaires, self-made billionaires, is because technology, they don't have to build factories or anything. They build a platform and they just have to make sure it could sustain, in Facebook's case, like half the world's population. And there's money to be made. Google would be another example. Jack Dorsey was the name that escaped me. So what I'm saying is this totally makes sense. Like, you don't even need to be an economist to understand that that's the way the economy is growing. And I'm going to show you that everything's an exaggeration. Many things, maybe 50% or more of the jobs are going in this direction in the next decade. All right, are you or your family in the top 1% of income worldwide? So if you take my evolutionary psych course, you know the answer to this. And let's say if you would, just do a little thought experiment here. If you were, would you give up your Netflix subscription or similar $20 a month to save 100 children per year from dying? So answer that question to yourself. I said to you, listen, you can't watch Netflix anymore. We're going to take that money and we're going to put it to saving 100 children per year. I think most people, unless you really love television, are going to say, hey, you know what? That's a deal I'm willing to make, right? We are the top 1% if you're making more than $34,000, right? Worldwide, we are. The fact of the matter is that our standard of living is quite high. And think about it. Can you live without Netflix, or in my case, Starbucks or something like that, and better put that money to use? Like I could drink Maxwell House maybe and put that difference to use. We can, but we don't, because evolution taught us that our well-being is better than anybody else's. We can't help it. And how could we? This is very easy to do, by the way. And just let me make another point on this slide before we leave it. I want to show you here what's happening is percent of global wealth. What you see, the point I made before, the top 1% is getting more and more wealth over time. The bottom 99% is getting less and less wealth over time, right? So we see this trend playing out. What makes us think it's going to continue? It's going to be accelerated, not only not continue, it's going to be accelerated as a result of technology. Well, there's what you could do with your $10 per month. It may be worth doing it now, even if you don't have, lucky enough not to have to give up Netflix or Starbucks, right? Is that, right, that hundreds of thousands of kids and people die from malaria each year, and they get bit during the night while they're sleeping. All they need is a net over their sleeping, and that can save that, right? But once again, the fact is that I want to say last year, like 300,000 kids in Africa died from not having nets, as an example. So this is a pretty easy problem to solve, right? Think about with trillion-dollar companies and even ourselves, buying that $10 caramel macchiato, whatever thing at Starbucks. For the record, I only drink black coffee. It's just $2.09, but it could still go a long way. Haven't had it in a couple of months. But I just want to give you a sense of this is easy to do, but it's just not part of our nature to do it for a variety of reasons. But it's not as though the wealth is not there. The wealth is there to buy nets, right? The wealth might not be there to send everybody to the moon, but the wealth is there to buy nets. And it just shows that, and I don't want to belabor this point, especially I'm a little scrapped for time, but look, these don't surprise me. Rich countries are hoarding supplies versus poor countries, right? And countries like the United States and Britain and France and Germany, they're trying to broker deals to get the vaccination first, if one exists. So if you will, I know Trump has taken a lot of pain for the Make America Great idea. Every country behaves like that. Is it a nice decorum to say that out loud? It's not. Every country behaves that way. Every country behaves for their people first. We'd expect that. Every group cares about their group first, right? So anyway, just more examples of selfishness. Now, let me just say that, and there's more in this slide that I want to cover here, but selfishness makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. In fact, this classic book on evolution, The Selfish Gene, basically made the point I made earlier, that evolution does not reward altruism. So as a result, selfish people are, those that hoarded the food in case they needed it for another day, did better than those who shared their food with others and didn't have it for another day. And as a result, we're really bad at doing non-selfish activities. So resource distribution example, we're destroying the earth, right? We care less about it, right? Eliminating species every day. We maximize our leisure at the expense of others' survival, right? We look at Netflix when that money could be going to somewhere else. And once again, other species are extinguishing at alarming rates. There's not too much caring about that. So a quote I like is by Diana Fleischman, who studies the evolution of morality. And what she says is that, listen, now that we're able to pay attention to it, we could see how our moral consistencies are magnified, right? We don't think of ourselves so selfishly, right? We don't really think that, oh, so I could live a little bit better, I am letting other people die. But the fact is, you can easily create that type of scenario, right? You could just say, well, look, I could tell you actually that that is true. If you spend $10 doing X, it could, help 100 people per year not die. So she's sort of pointing out that we need to wrestle with these moral inconsistencies to make forward. If we think of ourselves as great people, by the way, that the typical United States idea is we're this altruistic population that only goes to war to help other people. Furthest from the truth, as people have studied, but that's our idea. But not at all, right? We're only in it for ultimately selfish reasons. And what I mean by selfish is some way beneficial to ourselves. So we care about a bad leader in Iraq because we don't want our oil supply to be disrupted. A guy that's 10 times worse in Sudan, in Africa, we don't care about them because our oil supply is not going to be disrupted. It doesn't have to do with their behavior. It has to do with their behavior and what resources they might be blocking. And so interesting book. So it seems that we have these built-in biases to favor ourselves, right? So 90% of drivers believe they're in the top 10% of driving ability. I wasn't going to get into math today, but right, that can't be. Only 10% of people could be the best 10% of drivers, but most people think they are, right? And so if you will, we have these mechanisms that delude us to boot, that make us think that we're different than we are. Okay, second point, violence, right? So I made the point we're selfish, right? These three traits: violence, aggression, right? Violence and aggression is rewarded through the evolutionary process. We see this through crime and war as an example. So let me just talk a little bit about current hunter-gatherers, right? And once again, I realize I might have to sort of push ahead through some slides here, but this is a point I want to make. So these groups live the way we evolved. They're hunter-gatherers in the present world, and anthropologists study them. And what they find is so anybody that thinks that it's the media that makes us more violent, it's not. They'd have no exposure to the media, right? That this particular group, what in this famous book was studied, they're in constant warfare, invading other villages. Once again, they live in groups of somewhere between 70 and 100. Half of all men die in warfare. Here's a graph here. I mean, imagine if half of all the United States males died in warfare, what the population would be like. Why are they engaged in warfare, right? Motivation, resources, and reproduction, which evolution would predict. What do? They take the group's resources, they kill the children. The children are products of other people's genes, and they rape and kidnap the females because in an evolutionary context, female reproductive capability is a resource. And you can put forth half of your genes by forced copulation. So I just want you to let you know that our underpinning come from this, right? That underneath us is this. Now, once again, are we out there with spears, hand-to-hand combat? No, but that's more concerning. In a famous book by Christopher Hedges, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, he talked about the fact that soldiers find this an incredibly positive experience in some way, despite PTSD. It's an enticing elixir, gives us resolve, a cause, allows us to be noble, right? And the idea is that what it does is it triggers our tribalistic urges. So the idea is that when we're at war, right, we come together as a group. You get higher in-group bonding. So here's an example. 9/11 hit, we were attacked. Look at the congressional and presidential approval levels. They shot up, right? Then it sort of went down, and then we invaded Iraq. They shot up again. And in case you think it might just be some catastrophe or natural disaster, they didn't shoot up during Katrina, right? This massive hurricane. So, right, there is these bounces in approval and national unity, right? By the way, just for the record, after 9/11, US news reporters, like people in the media, started wearing flags on their lapel, which was never done before. and actually seen as a negative thing, the idea they should be objective reporters. And all of a sudden, they all had to wear a flag on their lapel, because if you didn't, it's like, why are you not wearing a flag? So this was incredible in-group bonding. Here's the problem. From an evolutionary perspective, it actually was pointed out by someone a long time ago, but who didn't have the foresight to know what was coming in terms of technology. So let's look at aggression here. Aggression is occurs in all species. All species fight for resources. That includes actual resources like food and territory, and females. So males fight more than females. But oftentimes these aggressive impulses have limits on them. Meaning, so imagine you had to choke somebody to death. You would have to have a certain physical strength and constitution to do that. But you could easily shoot someone, whatever your size, whatever their size. The technology allows us to kill fairly easily, right? So if you will, like if we look at war as an example, unlike those groups we just looked at, that there's a technology that exists for pretty easy killing and mass killing, right? That's why, once again, like someone going off with an army rifle can kill like 50 people in a bar in 10 seconds, right? These are the dangers of technology. And now let's bring mismatch theory in. So we have rage as an emotion, but we don't have any governor on our ability to do harm. Maybe if we were punching someone, we would eventually stop, especially if they gave subjugation cues. But the problem is we don't have those. And more concerning is the use of drones, where killing has become like a video game, right? Drones are used more and more, right? And by the way, this is, I'll just point it out to you. Don't look at it now because it will distract you. Click on this link later on to see the increase in drones. And for the record, who is the president that used drones more than anyone? Obama. So what I'm saying is, this is not about the current moment. We were heading in this direction. And who was the one that used them before that? George Bush, right? These are growing programs. They have nothing to do with politics or Republicans or Democrats. This is just the nature that we're headed in. Won't matter who's president. That person will use drones because it's an easy way to kill people. And it doesn't involve any sacrifice, right? These drone operators are sitting in Las Vegas. And this image is Iraq. Think about the level of mismatch we're talking about here versus having to kill someone with your hands, which is what you evolved for. So I'm gonna have to get to the existential threats. You don't need me to make a point about this one right now, right? We are ethnocentric, we're tribalistically oriented, right? Racism occurs in all humans, right? All humans display favoritism in research studies towards members of their own race and against other races. It's in our nature. It occurs throughout the world. In fact, the United States, as a rule, is not particularly bad in this regard, especially for the enormous amount of different races in the population. You could see places like India, which is maybe the worst right now, where Muslims and Hindus are literally killing each other. We've seen that in other places as well. They're killing each other as we speak. And there's some countries like Japan that has no racial problems because they have no diversity, right? And so what you see is in countries with less diversity, you don't have this problem. So globalism is a challenge for humans because of this. We can do it, but we have to be realistic about it moving forward. And we're not realistic about it because we don't accept that this is part of our nature. And it's a challenge. Globalism is a challenge. You could look at the data on this, but this was just the last example when I gave this lecture about a bombing. Once again, one religious group bombing another religious group in the same country. They're the same nationality. They're the same race. They're just a different religion. And they're bombing, okay? So, and by the way, just for the record here, genocides are going on today. They've gone on since historical times, as long as history has been studied. You could click on this and you could sort it by date to see the current genocides. going on and the history of genocides, think about what genocides are. They make sense in evolutionary terms. It's eliminating groups who are not genetically the same as you. And once again, in a competitive environment, this is an example, I'm not condoning genocide, obviously, but what I'm saying is a competitive environment, it makes sense to kill members who you're competing with, but don't share genes. And that's exactly what genocide does. And sometimes, by the way, in the case of like Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq, like they're incredibly similar. The slightest difference, the slightest ethnic difference can lead to groups killing each other on a daily basis. Okay, so we're selfish, we're tribalistic, we're violent. I want to get to my existential threats here. All of these are increasing. All right, I'm going to go quickly here. Trust me, all of these are increasing. Selfishness, I showed you, is increasing. Tribalism is increasing because it's being monetized by all media. Meaning, how do you increase your ratings? Well, you spin us versus them, right? It's us versus them on steroids. So just as an example, like if you look at Fox News versus MSNBC, do it, it's interesting. It's a different world. It's a different world that's being covered. It's an echo chamber. And it's further, there's data, it's further polarizing our population because each group is only seeing one side. The most extreme side is the way they monetize this. And obviously violence is increasing because we have the technology now where pretty soon you can have a suitcase of uranium and walk into Manhattan and detonate it and maybe kill, 2 million people, right? So forget about having to bring it over through a missile from North Korea. Right? And think about your phone as a computer, right? It's in your pocket now, right? That's where the technology is heading, and these are big problems, right? The doomsday clock is closer to doomsday than ever before. These are physicists, not evolutionary psychologists. I need to move forward, but you could take a look at this if you want. The link is there. And they're basically saying your population, your species is very vulnerable, and nuclear war is their big one. So as I said, part of this is trying to get insight into our self-deception, realizing who we are, right? That's what we're doing here. And I'll get more into some of these ideas in a second. What I could say though is it needs to be legislated, right? Imagine if you said, let me just make this point here, why I think it needs to be legislated. If we're going to redistribute income, imagine if we said, look, paying taxes is optional. You want to pay them, great. The government will function. If you don't want to pay them, that's fine too. How many people do you think would be paying taxes? Could the government function? No. Imagine if you said, look, why don't you save yourself for your retirement? We're not going to do Social Security anymore. Humans are not prepared to do that. That's why Social Security is essential. We don't ask people, do you want to do it or not? We tell them. We tell them you have to pay taxes. We tell them you have, right? And it's good for all of us. I would say we need to do that with sugar as an example. We can't let people, we've already seen that people can't control it. And we need to put a sugar tax and maybe more, because it's costing all of us. I believe that diabetes alone costs, or behavioral health problems cost us like $40 billion a year in money that could be avoided. So by the way, I find myself, if you go back 30 years, the fact that I'm looking for more regulation is surprising personally, but it's the only thing I could see to solve these problems. Now, the father of evolutionary biology, E.O. Wilson, who's like in his 90s and wrote a book, right? But said the greatest threat that humans face is tribalism, right? And that's what I want to focus on here, because that's going to derail the whole system, right? It's what you need conflict to create violence, right? What's going to create that conflict? Tribalism. What is it going to be spun by? By problems with resources, money, right? So research has found that tribalism increases in-group cohesion but decreases tolerance of other groups. So that's why it evolved as an adaptation. It made your in-group more secure, right? But you were less trustful and more aggressive to other groups. So that's why we're not just one giant happy species, but we've paired off in countries and smaller groups because that was an adaptation. You want to see how easy something like tribalism can be initiated? wear a Boston Red Sox jersey to Yankee Stadium and see what happens. So I show a video in my class, by the way, of someone, they get beer poured on their head and then they get pushed over around just because they have a Boston Red Sox jersey. Now, it doesn't help that they're probably all drunk. But my point is, you don't need much. There's been, a Rangers fan was killed outside a Flyers game just for wearing that jersey, right? And what is tribalism, right? It's the focus on intolerance of differences. However we break it down, we could break it down in different ways at different times: race, religion, ethnicity, country, sex, political party, even just beliefs that you have. What is your attitude about X? And I think that in this way, one of the most dangerous statements people can make, and we're hearing statements made like this all the time, you're with me or against me. There's no nuance in discussion here. So this is a point I made, right? The problem is that not only do we have these Paleolithic emotions, we have godlike technology and how we understand them. So can technology overcome tribalism? Right? If this is our greatest threat, is it going to overcome it? Well, that was the original mission of Facebook and Twitter, not to pick on Twitter here. Jack Dorsey on the nature of Twitter, the philosophy is helping the world realize that we're all facing the same problems. We should end this distraction of nationalism. That is the premise of the internet. I would rather us be proactive around solving these problems together. So we're connecting the world. Facebook connects the world. Well, how has that worked out? Existential threat number one, to me, the end of a functioning democracy. We're there now. It can get worse, right? Think about it. We can't agree on anything, and everyone's predictable in their opinions. So we know exactly the way the vote's going to go on things, except for a very small group of individuals. And right, and the fact of the matter is that this is a big problem when you're a democracy, because you need people to weigh issues differently. No ability to process facts. Everything is tribal mentality. And the media is spinning this further and further, right? Twitter is just, here's Twitter feeds. And you could see the groups are becoming further polarized. There's very little overlap in what they're tweeting and retweeting here. So if you will, someone gave me this idea that I had read about. I created a conservative Twitter feed and a liberal Twitter feed. By the way, Twitter, all you need is an email. It doesn't matter who you are, right? I could create 100. And it is fascinating the way it's playing out right now. It's two different worlds. On the conservative Twitter, it is people looting during riots and yelling to defund the police. And on the liberal Twitter, it is police beating up people, innocent people who are doing nothing wrong, and they're just being pushed over and so on. And even when I go on my different Twitter feeds, and even though I know I've created them, each side affects me viscerally for that side. It's kind of interesting, actually, as a mini experiment. So when I see someone yelling, defund the police and making the mayor of Minnesota walk away, I'm like, oh my God. And then when I see that these people being pushed over, doing nothing wrong, or hit over the head or sprayed in the face, right? Imagine without that insight, the impact that this is having on people. And for the record, it's not just Twitter, it's Facebook, right? They're monetizing this, they benefit this. Facebook and Twitter and CNBC and so on, their news is going through the roof. Trump was the best thing that ever happened to the media, because people watch the media more, because you're not learning anything new, right? We're just being further polarized. How can a democracy function like this? And this is only coming worse. And then just the last point I'll make about this, how do you get status in your group? In evolutionary terms, take the most extreme position. That's what gets retweeted. The more extreme the position is, the more likely it is to get retweeted. So if someone says something like, hey, look, we better find some common ground to save our democracy, that does not get retweeted. But if someone says, off with their heads, literally, that gets retweeted. And and this is influencing us. We know it influences behavior. Keep in mind, once again, I don't have too much time, Google and Facebook and Twitter, they're not worth $1 trillion each, because they sell nothing. It's because those that use them know that they influence behavior in the most profound way. If you want an ad, a political ad to be effective, you use Google, and they will create an ad that's incredibly powerful and will manipulate people's behavior. The same way when I search for stapler, literally did this recently, it was popping up everywhere on my Times feed and so on. I'm like, damn, the stapler is following me around. I got the stapler already. Enough. This is very powerful. That's why they're worth trillions of dollars. Not because they don't sell anything. Google gives all their stuff away for free. Twitter, Facebook, they're right. But if you don't believe me, this is a person worth looking at. Tristan Harris. Take a look at his website. He's an internet ethicist, former Google employee. He's saying this. And by the way, what he's saying, what I thought his metaphor was great. He's saying, behind your screen, when you're doing a Google search, behind your screen are 50 computer engineers trying to figure out how to manipulate your behavior. And they've done it incredibly well, to the point that the Russians, right, this has nothing to do with Trump, once again, the Russians already use this. They couldn't believe it. They're like, we don't even need to send spies anymore to the United States. All we need to do is figure this out, which they did masterfully. And they go in and they put all these polarizing messages, further polarize our population. This is proven, by the way, I forgot the woman's name who looked into this. Once again, pre-Trump election, who showed that the Russians were doing this, and they were even mocking us by putting out GIFs, by putting out figures that said things like, oh, my speedometer's not working, must be the Russians. The Russians put that out, right? Look at her analysis of Twitter and Facebook of subpoenaed information. This is a problem, and it's only becoming wider used. More people get their news from Twitter and Facebook and so on. And remember, it's not objective. And just do that little experiment yourself, by the way. It's worth doing. It's just remarkable about how these two feeds tell different worlds. Okay, I know if you have to drop off, existential threat too, wealth inequality, right? So existential threat will make us more tribalistic, but this is going to fuel it, because more than anything, keep in mind, what people care about is their resources or lack thereof, right? So meaning, if all of a sudden you have no resources, you become activated. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that the current protests have been so activated given the current economic climate for young people, right? I mean, you have a pretty grim prospects for the next decade. That is probably playing out in some ways in terms of where people are going. And I think that what we're seeing here is enormous increase in wealth inequality. I already talked about this. The middle class will disappear. The working class will be small, and basically it will become a dystopic, dangerous society where private security replaces the police. Remember, when you say defund the police department, right? Not to be overly political here, those that are wealthy will have their own police, and the rest of us will be left fending for ourselves in an increasingly dangerous environment. How do we deal with this as a population? So here I'm making a political statement, but the Democratic primary is over. There was one candidate that took this seriously. It was Andrew Yang. And he got little attention, although he hung in there from a small group of supporters. He always made the fundraising, right? And Andrew Yang was the only person that had this right. And, I heard an interview with him recently, and he's like, look, I thought I was right, but I never thought it would happen overnight with the pandemic. So think about what's happening here. What he said was this: all jobs, or many jobs, are going to be replaced by technology, and you're going to end up with a society that just has no meaning and no money. So what are we going to do about it? So his thing was to give universal basic income, right? By the way, it's the only solution, most likely. There's a few hybrids on this. That's what's going to have to happen, because what are people going to do? Think about it. Are robots replacing jobs? They aren't now. They are. Driverless cars, right, are here. Driverless trucks, so there will be no more cab drivers, Uber drivers, truck drivers, right? All that will disappear. It's fact, right? Have you used self-checkout at CVS or something like that? The CVS by my house only has this now, right? And they have someone standing that will help you check yourself out, but it's only self-checkout, right? Okay, one person manning 10 positions, 10 cashier jobs gone. Dental robot might be frightened by that. I'm frightened by this idea. It's incredibly effective, doesn't make any mistakes, fills your teeth. You want a radiologist or you want a computer reading your scan? Computer's much more accurate. Computers will replace radiologists. So if you want the most dystopic view, read this book, but it's on target. He's basically saying, listen, this is going to be, if you read the book Brave New World, where like everyone's on soma. In our case, it might be opiates. We have to medicate the population, especially angry males. And they have no meaning in their life, so we will give them some money and we'll say, listen, play video games all day on opiates. That is not too far of a glimpse of the future if we don't reverse that in some way. How much attention did Andrew Yang get for seriously taking on, right? By the way, and with what I like about his position here, right? He's like, look, I don't care what Trump is doing. I'm not responding to Trump tweets. I'm not talking about Trump. I just want to solve this problem. He's an entrepreneur, not a politician. He got little attention. Even during the debates, what were they talking about? What Joe Biden voted for in 1969. I mean, imagine how irrelevant that was, right? Or, you know, all these obscure facts about that. Who cares what Joe Biden voted for in 1969, right? That's what got the attention, though. I mean, meaning we would care if we had everything else solved. In the scope of things, this is much more important. And you know what he got attention for? Not wearing a tie, by the way. CNN did a story like, oh, he's the only male that's not wearing a tie right here in the debates. Great, right? Great media, thank you, right? Rome is burning, right? This is happening, right? Remember, this is incentivized by the stock market. By the way, I'm going to go over a little bit. If you have to go, I understand. I won't be offended. But Rome is burning. And what we care about is what Joe Biden or what Trump is tweeting today. Is that really what we care about? Right? That's what our media cares about. Trump didn't wear a mask. Let's spend days talking about that. Right? But all this is happening. It's on the doorstep. Harari and Andrew Lang on his website both play the numbers. The numbers are frightening. And once again, this is it's not questionable. The stock market is booming for the most part, despite the bad economy, because these companies don't need people. So you can have high unemployment and high stock market. As the companies lay people off, their value is greater because they don't have to pay for human capital. Robots work all day for free. You just make a single investment. So I'm just trying to help for if you're in some type of denial that this can't happen, that it can happen. It's happening, right? Once again, I mean, I never thought I'd be checking myself out at CVS, but I do. I never thought there'd be no cashiers, but there aren't in some stores. Now they're floating this idea. There's just this one person that helps you, you know, especially elderly people. Luckily, I'm somewhat technologically savvy. I know how to scan something. Some people don't know what they're doing. So the person scans you and moves you along. And by the way, should Andrew Yang be vice president? Yes, absolutely, right? He's been shown to be right post-pandemic. He said all the malls are going to close down. He just didn't know it was going to happen tomorrow. Are we living without malls? Absolutely. We don't need malls. We have Amazon. And think of how expensive malls are to run. And he even said this in a recent interview. He said, I thought I was right. I didn't know I was going to be shown to be right overnight. He was shown to be right overnight. But we can't pick Andrew Yang as vice president because Biden already has made a commitment to who he's picking. So this is just our broken democratic system. Not right. Rome is burning, but we're worried about all types of side issues. I'm not saying they're unimportant issues, but this is much more profound. And then the grand finale, right? Existential threats, right? Conflict that escalates to the level of nuclear war. And let me just say that this could be country specific. There will definitely be a Cold War with China now after this. And China is a major threat to the US economically. So you will see a Cold War develop once this pandemic is cleared. Both China and the US are armed nuclearly. And I'm a lot less concerned about that. I lived through a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Cold Wars are stabilizing. You worry about mistakes, but they're stabilizing, meaning this is like you're pointing a gun at each other. Nobody wants that. people have too much to live for. Chinese populations, relatively happy. US populations, relatively happy. They don't want to die. The problem is rogue states in terms of technology. Mistakes are a problem. And if you read the book, The Bomb, that came out recently, it's a terrifying problem, but I try not to think about that. But rogue states are a problem, because think about it. They have, this is, if you want to be an existential philosopher, the vulnerable world hypothesis is Nicholas Bostrom, right? He's saying, listen, we can easily destroy the future if we don't get this under control. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to move through this quickly. But, right, think about it. People who we've exploited throughout the world, right? Take a country like Saudi Arabia as an example. Every US president provided cover for Saudi Arabia, right? Military support for Saudi Arabia. Think about what Saudi Arabia stands for, right? This is not opinion, right? Meaning that women can't get an education or drive a car. They have harsh punishment rules, right? But they have lots of money, and they have lots of oil, and their money is connected to oil. Is this the kind of country that we would support, generally speaking, like by our own, aspirational values? Like, we care so much about women's rights. Like, how can we support a country that makes women cover up and that they don't have equal rights? We support them immensely, right? Because they have oil. We need that oil supply, less so now than before because we're producing more of it. The concern is what happens to these rogue populations that say, hey, the United States kept us down, right? This is ISIS in a sense. And the reality is revenge can cause people to do all kinds of things, even take their own lives, especially when it's fueled by religious reasons. So that's a big problem. And we better take that one seriously as well. The more we exploit populations, the more problems we create. And the last thing I'll say about this is there's a documentary on the use of drones. See what the use of drones is doing to populations. In Afghanistan, it's not making us popular figures, put it that way. Meaning this, you know where you have a strike. Let's say the worst guy in the world, objectively, is at a wedding, is at a party, let's say a birthday party, and there's 18 people there. Well, you know what? You take them out with a drone. Now, how does that group feel about the 17 other people that were killed? Not good. The drone has our flag on it. So if there's any remnants of it, they know where it came from. And if you don't believe me, go back to that. I believe the title of the documentary is Dirty Wars. Go back to that drone page. I'll send my slides out. And go back, or just go back to that drone page, and it calculates with each drone the number of target killings and then collateral damage. The correct collateral damage is enormous because you're always, right, the people are not isolated, right? If you're going to take me out, most likely you're going to have to at least take me and Peaches out, right? Or me and my family out. And the reality is that these people travel in groups, and much of it is their security. Are they innocent? Maybe not, but certainly innocent people. And then there's mistakes, by the way. So there was once where a wedding was actually targeted by mistake, and they meant to target something else. And, 50 people were killed by a drone. This is not a good way to go around the world making friends. And that's partly what's happening with the technology mismatch. Now, if I had to send a soldier to kill those people in hand-to-hand combat, that would be a problem. Mismatch allows you to do it like you're playing a video game. Okay, so you can read this for my conclusions. I think you have a sense of it. I just want to get to one thing here. I want to show you something that, once again, for those of you who could